Hello and welcome to the fifth and final session of this lecture. Today we will explore the many changes that happened in Joseon in the closing decades of the 19th century and address the impact on the arts and culture. The Korean peninsula changed irrevocably in October 1876 when Joseon was forced to sign the Treaty of Gangwon, which established diplomatic relations and opened Joseon ports for trade with Japan. It also granted extraterritoriality to the Japanese, who became exempt from import taxes, had the right to use their own currency in Korean ports, and, when in Korea, became subject to Japanese law. In the next decade, similar so-called unequal treaties were signed with Western nations, the first being the US-Korea Treaty of Amity and Commerce in 1882. Contact with Western nations initiated heated debates among Joseon intellectuals on Western civilization and modernization. On the one side was the conservative majority that advocated the adoption of Western skills, but urged the upkeep of so-called Eastern morality, Tongdo Sogi, literally Eastern way, Western skill. On the other side was a growing number of advocates of modernization and enlightenment. Kehwa. In 1896, Kojong, the last king of Joseon, oversaw the first major attempts to restructure the government and introduce social change. Commonly referred to as the Kabo reforms, they signified the formal move towards modernization. The drive for change also impacted the arts, as new materials and techniques, as well as new understandings of art, were introduced. In the 1880s, the term misul first came into use in Korea. Meaning fine art, it is the Korean pronunciation of the Japanese term bijutsu that had been coined in 1872 as a Japanese translation of the German words Kunstgewerbe und bildende Kunst. Mi, or bi in Japanese, means beauty, and sul, or jutsu in Japanese, means skill. The Japanese origins of the word misul did not go unnoticed, and during the colonial period, the term sohwa, literally calligraphy and painting, was sometimes preferred instead. The adoption of the word misul reflected Joseon's increased exposure to modern art, with Western art, particularly painting, becoming synonymous with the term. Unlike China and Japan, where Western art had been gradually introduced over several centuries, in Korea it arrived alongside significant political changes that had profound consequences for the peninsula's future. Therefore, the development of Korean modern art cannot be viewed purely within a cultural context. Instead, it was entwined with the highly politicized local and international events that unfolded rapidly within just a few decades. Prior to the late 19th century, only a small number of Yangban men had seen Western forms of art, either in books or in Beijing, where Catholic churches were decorated with Western-style murals. The Korean scholar Park Ji-won was deeply impressed by his encounter with artworks in these churches when traveling to Beijing in 1780. In his travelogue, he noted that the techniques of perspective and shading were beyond description, and that it seemed as if the subject matters were alive. In the 19th century, some Korean artists began to adopt Western painting techniques, like linear perspective, suggesting an emergent interest in new types of art. Among them were An Jung-sik and Cho Sok-jin, who were both highly esteemed painters in the Bureau of Painting that supplied paintings for the Joseon court. In 1881, they had been selected to accompany a diplomatic mission to Tianjin in China, where they learned Western drawing techniques at the Chinese Bureau of Machinery. The 1-year-long stay offered them the opportunity to experience new forms of art, including Western-style painting, the principles of which they applied in their own works. An Jung-sik's composition of Gyeongbokgung Palace in central Seoul in spring merges Western-style linear perspective with the aesthetics of traditional East Asian painting. It was painted in 1915, 5 years after Korea was annexed by the Japanese Empire. Yet An's painting presents no clues as to the fate of the Joseon rule. Rather, the palace that Lee Seong-ge, the founder of the Joseon Kingdom, built as the main residence and seat of power for the Lee family, stands as majestic as ever, flanked by Baekak Mountain, or present-day Bugak Mountain. As mentioned in the first session, the location of the palace was selected according to geomantic theories, and its majestic position, backed and flanked by mountain ridges, was captured well by An Jung-sik. An reflected the height of the mountains by placing horizontal bands of clouds between the palace buildings and Baekak Mountain. In doing so, he opted for a conventional East Asian way of expressing spatial distance in paintings. However, he adopted a one-point perspective for the pathways leading up to the main gate of the palace. One-point perspective is a drawing technique used to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. It is characterized by all lines in the drawing converging towards a single point on the horizon line, known as the vanishing point. This technique mimics the way objects appear smaller as they get further away from the viewer, creating a realistic sense of three-dimensional space. This technique had never formed part of traditional East Asian ink painting, where instead empty space, such as that created by the clouds in An's painting, was used to indicate spatial distance. An's use of one-point vanishing perspective is indicative of his adoption of Western-style painterly techniques in Korean ink paintings that came as a result of exposure to Jesuit paintings of Christ in churches in Beijing. Yet it's noteworthy that An selectively integrated Western methods to his ink painting by merging them with traditional Korean aesthetics. This balance maintained a distinct Korean identity in art. The introduction of one-point perspective to Korea marked a significant shift in artistic techniques and aesthetics, aligning more closely with Western art traditions. This change can be understood within the broader context of Korea's exposure to Western ideas and technology during the late Joseon dynasty and into the Korean Empire. The blending of Western and traditional techniques in art parallel broader efforts to modernize while preserving national identity during a time of rapid change and foreign presence in Korea. With the establishment of trade and diplomatic relations with Japan and Western nations, exposure to new forms of art was no longer channeled exclusively through China. The arrival of Japanese and Western artists facilitated direct access to art that challenged conventional East Asian ways of visual expression through the use of different materials and painting techniques. One such artist was Arnold Henry Savage Landor. He was an amateur British explorer who traveled extensively through Africa, Persia, Tibet, and China, among other regions. In December 1890, he arrived in Busan on the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula and spent the subsequent months traveling across the region. Although he was humble about his artistic talents, by the time he reached Korea, he had already painted portraits of several prominent individuals he had met during his travels, including American President Benjamin Harrison and Countess Kuroda, the second wife of Japanese Prime Minister Kuroda Kiyotaka. In Korea, his skill in rapidly sketching local people and scenes drew the attention of the royal family. When he arrived in Seoul in 1891, he was told that the royal family were keen to see his paintings. On meeting the royal family, he wrote in his book, "Both king and princess were very anxious to see what so-called European painting was like, as they had never yet seen a picture painted by a European." Members of the royal family were so enthralled by his paintings that they commissioned him to paint their portraits. As a result, Lander painted portraits of Prince Min Yonghwan, Commander-in-Chief of the Korean Army, and Prince Min Yongjun, Minister of Interior. Unfortunately, the current whereabouts of the paintings are not known, but Lander included photographs of them in the book he wrote about his travels in Korea. Titled Korea or Chosen, The Land of the Morning Calm, the volume was published by a British publisher in 1895. It is one of the earliest English-language writings about Korea, authored by an individual who had visited the Korean peninsula. Seeing that little was known about Korea at this time, and few had the chance to visit East Asia, the book catered to the growing desire among Europeans and Americans for information about the so-called mysterious Orient. A few years after Lander's arrival in Korea, the professional painter Hubert Voss traveled to Korea, and like Lander, he painted portraits of leading members of the Joseon royal family, including Kojong himself. Voss's painting of Kojong is significant, as it was the earliest painting in the Western medium of oil of a Joseon ruler. In her lecture on Western art, Dr. Son will discuss this painting in more detail. By the 1880s, the Joseon government realized the necessity for modernization and began actively seeking knowledge about Western technologies and institutions. Meiji Japan served as the nearest and most relevant model. Thus, Japan played a dual role as both an agent of progress and an imperialist threat. Enthusiastically embracing the policy of what in Japanese was called Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, the Meiji government extensively borrowed from European political, economic, military and cultural systems, tailoring them to fit Japan's needs. At the height of the Bunmei Kaika era, Japan launched the first national industrial exhibition in Ueno Park in Tokyo in 1877. This event was inspired by the Vienna International Exposition of 1873, the first international fair officially attended by the Meiji government. Japan's participation in these exhibitions aimed to foster a convergence of Western technologies and Japanese innovations to promote local industry. When the second National Industrial Exhibition opened in Tokyo in March 1881, it presented an ideal opportunity for Korea to observe Japan's modernizing changes, and in April, the Korean government dispatched a large delegation of 64 persons to Japan. The task of the so-called Korean Courtiers Observation Mission, Shinsa Yuramdan, was to make detailed records on Japan's modern structures, from industrial facilities and communication systems to ministerial departments. The Korean mission stayed in Japan for 4 months, where they met with high-ranking politicians and bureaucrats and toured selected sites and institutions. The opening of Korea's ports and Kojong's dispatch of courtiers to Japan and later to America marked the onset of significant political and social changes in Joseon that had lasting impact on the understanding and valuation of Korean art, both within the peninsula and beyond. The formalization of diplomatic relations between the Joseon dynasty and American and European nations coincided with a growing interest in the peninsula and its cultural heritage outside East Asia that was to have long-lasting impact on the Korean cultural milieu. This lecture has presented insights into the changes that happened within the Chosun cultural environment in the closing decades of the 19th century. Triggered by Chosun's relationship with Japan, America, and European nations, this period was a time of flux. On the one hand, many Yangban and members of the Chosun royal family were excited about the influx of new skills and techniques, such as the introduction of oil painting and linear perspective. But on the other hand, there was also keenness to preserve local Korean traditions. This tension between the local and the new was to become one of the most defining characteristics of Korea in the early 20th century.